Good afternoon. My name is Mary O'Shea, and I'm a student in the Master of Public Administration program here at Queen's. I'm honored to be your host for this week's Policy Speaker Series, presented by the School of Policy Studies. We begin by acknowledging the Indigenous territory on which we have the privilege of meeting today. The territory Kingston sits on has been the site of human occupation for thousands of years and is the homeland of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We are grateful to the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island for welcoming us to their territory. Today we will be using an interactive program called Slido, that's S-L-I-D-O, to ask questions of our speaker. You can pose your questions by going to slido.com and entering the code MPA18. Members of the audience can vote for the questions they are most interested in having answered, and we will also be taking questions asked in person. It is my privilege to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kathy Brock, whose talk is titled Medically Assisted Dying in the Canadian Federation, for Good, but for Ill. Dr. Brock is a professor here at the School of Policy Studies and is cross-appointed to the Department of Political Studies. She is the current past president of the Canadian Association of Programs in Public Administration and past National Research Chair for the Institute of Programs in Public Administration. Dr. Brock has published books, academic articles, and reports on nonprofit and voluntary organizations, Canadian and comparative politics and government, federalism and constitutional matters, and Aboriginal governance and issues. She is currently working on a manuscript on the operation of the Canadian federal system and articles on the views of DMs and CAOs regarding the current state of the public service, public sector ethics, and Aboriginal policy and Indigenous governance. She has commenced a new study called Riding the Trump-Trudeau Wave. Active in public affairs, Dr. Brock has served as a nonpartisan advisor to federal, provincial, and territorial governments, political parties, an Aboriginal organization, nonprofit organizations, and on a number of national and local boards, including the Limestone Learning Foundation. She's a frequent commentator in the national and local media on Canadian public affairs. As all of her students here today are well aware, Dr. Brock is an exceptional and dedicated professor. She received the 2008 Pierre Decelle IPAC Award for Teaching Excellence in Public Administration and the 2009 Frank Knox Award for Teaching Excellence at Queen's University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kathy Brock.
Thank you, Mary. And Celia, can I turn on my mic and then do I have to turn this one off?
We have both of them going.
Okay. Okay. There, how's that for everyone? The reason why I wanted to do that is because I like to walk around when I'm talking. And so this just gives me the freedom to do that. I think it's just a little more relaxed in that if a question comes up that you want answered immediately, please do stop me. Otherwise, questions will be for the end where we can have a little fuller discussion of them. Well, 2,149. That's the number of medically assisted deaths that have occurred in Canada between December 10th, 2015, when the Quebec legislation came into effect, and June 30th, 2017. We'll get the final numbers for 2017 shortly. But those numbers are very deceptive, because we do know that medically assisted dying has been going on in Canada prior to the legislation coming into effect, and it is in effect and being practiced in ways that are not necessarily captured by the reporting statistics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But the point of my talk today is also to assess the Canadian Federation. Canada has been criticized, as we know, and has been condemned for taking action on this issue recently. However, this issue is an interesting test of our federal system and how well it's working, So that is what I'm going to focus on, because I believe how our governments act together ultimately affects how well citizens fare in this country of ours. So that's why I focus on the Federation. The plan then is to talk about the Canadian promise of federalism very briefly, and a test that I've devised for looking at Canadian federalism. Talk briefly about how we got to where we are with medically assisted dying, some of the alternatives to the legislation that was put into place by the federal government, and then to look at the legislation, what's working, what needs work, current challenges, and the way forward. And I conclude with how well are we really doing? How well are our governments serving our citizens? So, let's begin. So contrary to much commentary, I do argue that our governments are working fairly well. Our governments, when they hold true to the promise that was made in 1867 and the guidance laid down by our founders, which was broad enough to encompass issues that they could not have foreseen, they do quite well. And I think this issue does show that the governments have come quite a long ways in cooperating. Although I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm saying this on a day when we've got BC and Alberta fighting over pipelines, alcohol, BC wines in particular and that. But aside from those little disputes, the Federation does work fairly well. And I think even those actors and our federal government could take some lessons from the original founders. Our Federation has to be responsive to changing global environment, but also changing citizen expectations. And it means that when they enact legislation, they also have to anticipate challenges to it, and they have to expect that citizens are not just going to receive legislation fairly passively. The reason why I was originally drawn to the issue of medically assisted dying, this was before the legislation even came into effect, was because it's a very contentious area of policy. It's very difficult for governments to act here without offending large segments of the population and inciting issues among them. So it also means that any legislation passed then can be subject to challenge, and the challenges can become very heated. It's a symbolic issue, and I've worked on symbolic issues throughout my career. So federalism then promises a balance between unity and diversity. It wants to create a binding community, but respect differences. And this is an area where we really do see the legislation coming into play, where it's tried to create an overarching framework for medically assisted dying, but then tolerate differences within the provinces and among the provinces. And it means there has to be a flexible balance. There has to be a give and take. And it has to serve the interests of the citizens. And that means going beyond thinking of issues as division of power issues, but thinking of how do they accommodate the different citizen interests as they exist within the provinces and within the Federation as a whole. And I argue federalism is important because it operates to enhance democratic values. And that's very important with an issue like medically assisted dying, because it provides various access points for citizens to ensure that their views are respected on a contentious issue. They don't just have one forum to go to, they have multiple fora that they can access when they want to see changes, request changes, or fight for them. It comes to the fore, in this case, very strongly. So when we're talking about federalism, we're talking about a form of deep federalism where the spirit of accommodation, of harmony and striving for harmony and respect goes beyond the governments right into the units themselves. So when I have a test for federalism, want to know how well and accurately do the federal political institutions reflect social and political balance of forces within the system? To what extent do these institutions channel the influence and articulation of unity and diversity into peaceful and productive means? That is, do they help quell dissent and stop some of the dysfunction that can occur when there are strong differences on policy issues? Do they help us reach a productive answer? Is the appropriate balance in combining unity and diversity achieved? So, do we give too much to the provinces, and are there too many inconsistencies? Does the legislation at the federal level and then the adjustments at the provincial level hold together? Do they hold together, or is there a breakdown with them? And ultimately, the most important test, I think, are the interests of citizens being served? So, how did we get to medically assisted dying? 1993, in the Rodriguez case, the Supreme Court of Canada upheld the restrictions in the Criminal Code of Canada against assisting a suicide. And they were very clear. It was a very compelling case, a very tragic case, but the Supreme Court said no. Given the state of the law and the state of conditions in Canada, they could not strike down those sections of the Criminal Code. They would stand. So they did. But the issue was not satisfied by that decision. It was in a state of unsettlement. And you could see that because there were challenges going forward in law. There were issues that were raised before medical bodies. Governments had to debate this in their legislatures numerous times, and they kept coming down with the same answer, that no, we're not going to move there. But at the same time, we saw Canadians going to the Dignitas clinic in Switzerland. We saw jurisdictions in the United States beginning to acknowledge medically assisted dying and the right of people to engage in that practice. And Carter came up. It was a Supreme Court case dealing with two women who applied for, well, in the case of one woman applied for medically assisted dying. In the other case, family members who had gone over to the Dignitas clinic so that their mother could have a death became partners in this case because they didn't want to be charged with assisting a suicide. Suicide itself was legal. It was assisting a suicide. So sections 14, 241, 245 of the Criminal Code that basically prohibited assisting a suicide, administering a noxious substance to someone that would cause their death, and so on. Supreme Court struck down those sections of the Criminal Code, and it gave the government a leeway period to enact the legislation. The Conservatives dithered, the Liberals came into office, and they dithered. They applied for an extension, and the Supreme Court of Canada, in one of the ways that it likes to take down the politicians a little notch, said, yeah, we'll give you an extension for the period of the election. So it was a 4-month extension only, at which point I'm sure all the federal drafts people said, holy tomcats, what are we going to do? Because they scrambled to put together the legislation, and the legislation was enacted just under the deadline. In the meantime, we'd had a provincial territorial report on the issue that specified what they thought should be done with medically assisted dying, and we had the Quebec legislation come into effect, and much discussion about what we should do. So, it's hard to read, but I want to talk a little bit about this. And this is where we get into analysis of some of the provisions in the legislation, and although I do return to them later as well. So we get into some of the difficulties with the legislation. But the federal legislation, in the very first box, The criteria is where we're seeing a lot of the challenges go through to this legislation right now. It says you have to be 18 years old. You have to be able to make health decisions for yourself. Voluntary, uncoerced decisions. Informed consent. You have to be informed of what you're doing and be able to show that you understand what you're doing. And they also specified publicly funded, which basically precludes medical tourism. They didn't want people coming into Canada and availing themselves of medically assisted dying. They wanted to keep it for Canadians, so when they said publicly funded, they've kept it to people who are eligible. So for example, in Ontario under OPIP. Medical conditions, grievous and I always blow that word, irremediable, serious, incurable illnesses, disease, or disability, advanced state of irreversible decline, enduring and intolerable suffering, pain relief, unacceptable. Pretty narrow conditions. The Supreme Court, if you glance over at the SCC, the Supreme Court of Canada, their conditions were a lot broader. And the provincial territorial report, their conditions were also broader. Notice that those two jurisdictions, or those two bodies, did not specify an age limit, which is one of the areas in contention. And Quebec just said you had to be of full age. But now Quebec, its legislation, has been brought into line with the federal legislation just by incorporation, so the restrictions at the federal level apply to Quebec citizens as well. Where we're seeing a lot of challenges comes around the type of illness and around death being reasonably foreseeable. People are challenging those issues in particular because they're saying, well, if I have an illness that's intolerable, that I can't bear my suffering, why does my death have to be reasonably foreseeable? And when this was debated before the Parliament of Canada, they had witnesses who said, when you use these types of words, you're obfuscating the issue. What you're doing is you're basically saying it has to be a terminal illness. And if that's what you mean, then say it. And let that be challenged. Other people argue that when you say that death has to be reasonably foreseeable, or when you put the other restrictions, advanced state of irreversible decline, and when you add those safeguards in, you're basically infantilizing people who have grievous conditions or long-term conditions that cause them immense suffering, but who might not elect for an assisted death. They say that by having those safeguards, you're saying basically we couldn't make these choices for ourselves. Other groups are arguing, no, we need those safeguards in place. And why are they in place in the legislation? One of the things I find very striking about the federal legislation is how closely it conforms to the state of public opinion. So if we look at Angus Reid polls in 2016 and prior to that in 2015, we can see that if you remove a hard age restriction, support drops from 58% to 12%. And people repeatedly say, you know, somebody could approve this for my child without me knowing. And that's when you just get the support falling away. Generally, you hear a statistic that says Canadians support assisted dying, medically assisted dying, in the range of 80% or above. But actually, if you look at those stats, it's only if all of these criteria are in place. It deals with a very narrow segment of the population. Death is foreseeable. As you pull away any of those criteria, support tends to drop significantly. So the legislation then was well crafted to meet public opinion, broadly assessed, but it is running into some significant challenges. One of the things that it does specify is that you need a medical or nurse practitioner and a second opinion on the criteria, witnesses, and all of the jurisdictions are coping to meet those challenges. And I'm going to come back to them. We're going to go over some of this ground again. So some of the significant things about those reports, some points of commonality. First of all, the name. In the course of the discussions and from Rodriguez right up to the current, we moved from assisted suicide to medically assisted dying, at which point it was pointed out that the acronym would then be MAD, and they didn't want to associate this practice with a negative word, so they moved to MAID, because a MAID helps, supports. So the nomenclature was important. When you're dealing with a contentious issue, it helps to create a mental association with something that's less offensive. So rather than suicide, it's dying. Medically assisted, because we trust doctors and nurses. And if it's associated with a profession that's respected, the practice can't be bad, right? One of the costs is we've removed the sense of responsibility. With suicide, it's the choice of the individual. With dying, that decision can be made outside of the individual. So that is one of the costs in the legislation. Generally, in all of the reports, narrow grounds. There are clear medical, well, not clear, but there are medical criteria. And you have to have approval by 2 people. I was personally disappointed when I saw the grounds because I'd been doing a lot of work and research on the practice around the world. And one of the things that I had noticed was when you look at a clinic like the Dignitas Clinic in Switzerland that will approve a medically assisted death for anyone who has a condition that is intolerable to them, it provides a place for people to go to apply for a death. But then the very first thing that they do is refer you to a specialist in your area of pain. And over 80% of people never return to the clinic because they get someone who knows their area of pain. And very often in a country like Canada, we have uneven medical services across the country, and the access to specialists or experts is uneven as well, which can encourage people to think negatively of their condition or go into a state where they think the only option, the only way out, is a death. So, grounds, I think if we had had a different system, the grounds could have been wider. Given the system we adopted, though, probably it's better to keep the grounds narrow. And I'll come back to that. Public funding includes medical tourism and concurrent jurisdiction. The feds and provinces have to act together, and that's one of the key tests of this legislation. Can they really act together well, and how is the public reporting done? Those are the points of commonality, and those are bars that the legislation had to meet. So we established comparable standards across the country and then told the federal government and the provinces to go ahead and make sure that things are working well. Public funding. One of the weaknesses with the legislation and the way it's been acted in the provinces is that northern and remote areas do not have access to the same level of services. And what this raises in my mind is a question of, is this an inadvertent area of discrimination against our Aboriginal citizens, once more? The implications for people who do not have ready access to medical care and practitioners they could be negatively impacted and not have the same access as other citizens. And we know from the recent Ontario case, equal access is very important. It trumps even freedom of religion and conscience. So we didn't get that guarantee, and the federal government hasn't moved further on the funding issue. We do need a federal, provincial, territorial accord to create some commonality and ensure that the jurisdictions are moving together so citizens, when they look at the schemes across the country, can see that certain critical points are in place. We do not have an accord in place now. The age, 18, very contentious. There was an agreement on that, and we are now seeing some challenges go forward to the question of age. Rather than a hard age, people are arguing is, if someone is mentally competent, then that should be the criteria, not an arbitrary number. So that's where we're going to see more challenges coming up. And given that Quebec is in a place where it didn't have an age, but now an age applies to it, that opens the door for interesting challenges. The differences across the country make the legislation vulnerable. And so I'll give you an example of that. One of the biggest weaknesses in the federal legislation applies to medical practitioners. The criminal code restrictions were removed for people who engage in this practice in good faith and meet the criteria. However, the federal legislation didn't prevent any legal proceedings that were of a civil nature against medical practitioners, or one of the other effects too is that the federal legislation said that people who do not comply with the regulations in the provinces could be subject to prosecution. This means that by violating standards set down by their own associations or regulatory bodies, doctors, nurses, could be found criminally liable. They didn't get full indemnification from legal suits or from criminal actions. They only got it for those areas of the criminal code. And this was one of the problems, I think, of rushing the legislation through. So now, Ontario, in its recent Bill 84, has actually closed that loophole and said that no legal or other proceedings may be brought against practitioners acting in good faith. But that's Ontario. Other provinces and territories don't have that. And actually, in the Northwest Territories, they state very clearly in their interim guidelines that if you promote, encourage, incite an assisted death, you could be found criminally responsible still. Well, does that mean any transfer of information? That could make doctors vulnerable. So there are some serious inconsistencies with the way the legislation is being practiced and as the guidelines come down. And I guess I should also add, if you go to the federal provincial websites, they link up to the federal site. They're all now brought into nice conformity. They have the same headings when they go to assisted death in the sections for them. Palliative and end-of-life care listed first, then medically assisted dying listed second, then a referral to a coordinated care service in the jurisdiction so you can avail yourself of this service. But that's where the commonality often stops. Some of the websites don't provide any more information. Ontario is quite good. BC is quite good. Some of the other jurisdictions are not as good. Alberta requires you to register before you can get their information out. New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, their sites are weaker. They don't have a lot of information. The Yukon is surprisingly good on this. So there's unequal access to the care in the jurisdictions as a result, and some of the provinces don't have their regulations or their guidelines in place at all. So there's a lot of discrepancies across the country with it. right now. So, the legislation says that success is contingent upon a consistent approach to medical access and dying across Canada. There's been some progress. Even the websites between October and right now, they have progressed tremendously. But, as I just pointed out, there are still some problems. There are some key differences between the jurisdictions. There's no consistent approach to palliative and end-of-life care. They mention it, they highlight it on the websites. There is no comprehensive look at how to link up medically assisted dying with those two types of practices, and to actually put everything in a full spectrum of end-of-life care. This is one option. Instead, it's centered out and treated differently when, if we want to approach this issue in a more rational and holistic way where people really can get the best health care, you need to unite palliative care with medically assisted dying and have them united. Quebec has done this. And Quebec did provide a model for going forward, but it was not in conformity with where Canadian public opinion was. Nunavut tends to emphasize palliative care, and Nunavut and Northwest Territories are very careful in endorsing any form of suicide. Smaller provinces are struggling, shortage of doctors, low pay. BC and Manitoba have imposed additional criteria to the federal ones, and they all have their own reporting criteria, so the figures are suspect on this practice. So, we've seen a lot of debate, and we've seen the government's trying to create a common approach and then respect diversity within that approach, but it's not clear that they've achieved that. So where does it leave the citizens? Well, a new need, and what was defined as a need, has been met in a socially responsible way. The legislation is a start. It's flawed. It'll be interesting to see what happens when the 3 working bodies of the Canadian Council of Academics report at the end of the year on the age restriction, on advanced directives, and on mental health issues and how they should be dealt with under the legislation. But they've tried. But there's a checkerboard effect across the country. It's a publicly funded service, but it's uneven. And there's no further money commitment to ensuring that there is equal access throughout this country. It's a commitment to public record keeping, but the monitoring is weak. There's varied criteria schema. We're getting some stats. How reliable are they? They say there's a pledge for a coordinated service, but they haven't been able to reach an accord. Quebec models approach to end-of-life care, but the rest of the country hasn't followed suit. National values, but we could see challenges as we're seeing by the most recent one, where doctors and medical practitioners who were of the Christian faith challenged the legislation and the provincial regulations in Ontario under the legislation that required them to give referrals for the service. And they said this violated their personal beliefs. And the decision that came down from the Ontario Divisional Court by 3 justices said, no, there is an infringement, but it's a reasonable one on freedom of religion and freedom of conscience in the protection of equal access to this service. There was a question about whether the regulations set down by Ontario should be challenged underneath by the Charter itself, provisions, but the court said, no, there is jurisdiction here. We can actually look at this and whether or not the doctors are being denied a right. but they said, no, it's a reasonable limit on their rights. That is a tough one, and I wonder if the courts might have gotten it wrong. We're going to see it appealed up, although there's a high correlation between Ontario decisions, particularly at the Court of Appeal level and the Supreme Court of Canada. And the Divisional Court is fairly reliable, but sometimes not always. So we'll look at that and see whether or not it does go further, does go up to the Supreme Court of Canada. But one of the things that they could have done was just said, the material must be made available by doctors or by religious institutions, and the coordinated service for the province is available so people can avail themselves of that. However, the weakness in that is that it's very difficult in some jurisdictions to figure out how to get a medically assisted death. And as I said, in the case of Alberta, you have to register, and a lot of people who are just looking into it might not want to register. I also know a friend of mine personally who went through, he committed suicide, but he had looked at the Ontario procedures and they wouldn't have been possible for him to use in the time he had left, and he would have had to spend too much time in his short life to meet the criteria. So it's still not workable criteria there. Defined services, but there are arbitrary exclusions. We do have to look at questions of mental health. We have to look at questions of illnesses that are chronic, and we're seeing the Lamb case and other cases come up dealing with issues that are chronic but not necessarily terminal, or where death is not necessarily reasonable foreseeable, and see whether or not the criteria are just too restrictive. On the other hand, we don't want people to be pushed into having an assisted death who really don't want it, where it's not 100% voluntary. And one of the things that we've seen with Canadian public opinion is support for the practice really drops off significantly. If people believe that someone could be coerced by family or by the state into accepting an assisted death in order to save money, people really don't like that idea. And as healthcare becomes more expensive, this is an area that could become more contentious, where people feel that medical treatment was denied, withheld, or someone was encouraged to take a death to save money for a hospital that's financially strapped. Let's hope that doesn't happen. It also is more complex as there's more technology and lives are being prolonged and costs are going up as well. So we do have it medically provided and decriminalized, but I'd be very nervous if I were a medical practitioner engaging in this at this point. I would not feel completely indemnified, and I would feel worried because there are sections of provincial territorial regulations and the federal legislation that does open them up to being vulnerable to challenge, even in how they interpret the criteria and what it means to be good faith. And the court so far has said, we will look at medical opinions of what these illnesses are and what these terms mean, but we'll offer opinions as well. Well, what does that mean? Public administration, but I'm not sure we've met the standards of fairness, consistency, and universality. More compassionate approach, but it's inconsistent. And I would argue it's not the preferred policy answer, but that's for another paper. And the citizens, then, they got a service, but how well? So what do we get? On the first question, there's a clear pass. They did try to balance forces and create a good balance between people's opinions. There was a serious attempt there. Do they actually solve things in a positive, productive way? I'd say it passed with qualification at its best. Is appropriate balance in combining unity and diversity? Government's failed there. Got to remember I'm a prof, so I have to grade them, right? And are the best interests of citizens being served? I think the most we can do is give them a deferred grade at that point. Overall, I think Canada's muddling through with some significant costs to citizens. And I just want to highlight one thing that I wrote, and that is, eligible persons may find themselves in the tragic position of having to end their lives early or to choose a medically assisted death if a more comprehensive end of life approach to health care, including more robust palliative and hospice care, is not provided. Physically disabled persons may see themselves as infantilized by the legislation. Persons and practitioners may find themselves baffled by what constitutes a reasonably foreseeable death and by whom is actually eligible. Medical practitioners may face criminal sanctions for breaches. Public servants may find themselves bewildered at having to administer such a healthcare service. And a vast array of persons with grievous and irremediable or serious and painful medical conditions who wish a peaceful death may not have their wishes granted. Thank you.